London sells itself with an official vibe of expensive, prestigious, we're the world's financial capital, and an unofficial one that says, lovely to have you, but you probably won't be able to live here. Britain's capital, with an economy worth over $500 billion, is essentially a standalone country if you take it out of brackets. A solid, middle-of-the-pack global economy. Somewhere near those tidy states people describe as, everything's just fine there, no drama. For almost 200 years, London worked like the planet's money vacuum. Banks, consulting, lawyers, salaries that made the rest of Europe pretend it wasn't impressed. It pretended very convincingly. But step away from the postcards, the skyscrapers, and the Thames views, and another mode kicks in. Reality. By 2023, it turned out that more than 1 in 50 people in London has no home. Not in some metaphorical sense, but literally. And this isn't a Dickens-era relic or a Sherlock Holmes subplot. It's a recent update, an increase of more than 50% in just a decade. As a result, Britain suddenly climbed to the top of the homelessness rankings among developed countries. At the same time, real wages, the ones that matter after inflation, have been stuck in don't touch anything, it'll do mode for about 15 years. Prices, meanwhile, went into orbit, especially housing, which quietly transformed from a basic need into a game called congratulations. You passed the selection. Maybe. Against that backdrop, people leaving doesn't look tragic at all. It looks logical. A young professional compares London to New York and stumbles on some awkward arithmetic. You can earn twice as much there, while the cost of living is only about 30% higher. No advanced math, no consultants required. After that, the suitcase somehow ends up by the door on its own. Doctors and nurses are leaving especially fast. People tired of running an endless marathon for a paycheck that brings neither a sense of security nor any real reason to smile. This mass right I'm off moment is actually a pretty accurate snapshot of the economy. The most ironic part is that at the same time, Britain is taking in record numbers of newcomers. Mostly because of education, which is still considered among the best in the world. But as they say, there's a catch. Studies show that on average, those leaving are noticeably more qualified than those arriving. In recent years, net migration has mainly increased the share of low-skilled workers. And that's no longer a story about growth and innovation, but about, we'll deal with it later. Lower productivity, weaker services, and poor quality in everything eventually sold under the British label. So the obvious question arises. How did a country with money, history, and status start losing its young and smart? The answer is painfully mundane. Living standards are slowly but steadily sliding down. No collapse, no panic. Just a quiet decline. What's more, if you mentally subtract London, its taxes, jobs, and population, the country's average standard of living drops sharply. So sharply that the remaining economy starts to look weaker than that of some Eastern European countries that were not long ago politely referred to as catching up. They caught up, overtook, and didn't bother apologizing. The result is a strange picture. London still shines, money still circulates, the shop window still sparkles. But more and more people realize that looking at the display is pleasant, while living inside the shop comes with endless paid add-ons. While one city keeps dragging along the status of a still rich country, the rest of the territory increasingly feels like an app that hasn't been updated in years, but can't be deleted for some reason. All of this fits neatly into a broader trend. The sense that Britain's best years are no longer a plan, but an archive. And this isn't just social media whining. In 2007, the average British family lived only slightly worse than families in wealthy northwestern European countries. The gap was about 8%, manageable. Over the next 15 years, that gap widened to 20%. If things continue the same way, an average family in Slovenia will soon live more comfortably than one in Britain. And by the end of the decade, Poland will calmly reach that level too, the very country people here once liked to joke about. Turns out the joke had a timer. The most uncomfortable part of this picture is how stagnant incomes hit those who never had a safety net to begin with. At the top, Britain still feels fine, consistently somewhere in the global top 5 in terms of living standards. The middle class is less cheerful, around 12th place. And the poorest 5% live with the feeling that they were left behind in the car park of history. This isn't about comparisons with Germany or the Netherlands anymore. Last year, British families with the lowest incomes lived about 20% worse than similar families in Slovenia. Yes, really. A country with global status and a financial center suddenly loses on basic comfort to places it not long ago dismissed as New Europe. And this is where the real paradox kicks in. More and more people are arriving, yet public services are getting weaker and skilled professionals fewer. Schools are overcrowded. Healthcare is running on fumes. Infrastructure can't keep up. And those who actually can and want to work increasingly open a world map and think, what if not here? So the question, why are people leaving one of the richest countries in the world, no longer sounds provocative. It sounds like everyday observation. The answer, by the way, is dull and conspiracy-free. Not so long ago, Britain was a place young professionals from all over the world wanted to move to. And Britons remember that perfectly well. Polls show that around 60% of people believe life was better in the 90s and 2000s than it is now. And this isn't the usual, things were greener back then. There really was a sense that life was moving forward, not just changing the interface. That era is now recalled with a light but persistent nostalgia. British culture dominated globally. Music like Oasis and the Spice Girls was everywhere. The country looked confident, calm, and slightly smug. In a good way. There was a feeling that everything was under control and would only get better. Today, more and more people feel that this confidence has simply evaporated. The economy is still big, money is still moving somewhere, reports look solid, but that wealth reaches ordinary people less and less. And so the conclusion becomes very simple. If the future here isn't getting better, it makes sense to look for it somewhere else. In the 90s, Britain was swept by a powerful, we finally won vibe. The Cold War was over, the world exhaled, and inside the country there was a sense that things would now grow on their own. Of course, the past is always slightly polished in memory, but in the case of the 90s, it's not just nostalgia. It really was a period when Britain's economy felt confident, even despite a rough start to the decade. Currency turmoil, exits from European mechanisms, and a recession that shook plenty of people at the time. From around 1992, things turned sharply upward. Britain entered its longest period of economic growth since the Second World War. No constant crashes, no regular crises, just a steady climb. This was made possible by a lucky mix. Reforms, reasonably competent financial policy, and a global environment that played along. The economy grew almost on autopilot, GDP expanded, and productivity marched forward like someone who'd accidentally discovered cheat codes. Finance played a special role in this upgrade. Credit was flowing freely, especially mortgages. People bought homes, spent money, and the economy spun faster. On top of that, business rules made Britain extremely attractive to investors. Money came in, money stayed, and for a long time, the country even earned more abroad than it lost. It all looked like a well-built startup that had finally turned a profit and started believing in itself. But this success had one quiet, unpleasant side effect. Britain drifted ever deeper into a service-based economy. Banks, offices, consulting, sleek, stylish, expensive. But these sectors created far fewer jobs for ordinary people than the old industrial base. Factories, mines, and heavy industry gradually shut down. And those jobs were mostly located in regions that were already short on money, far from London and its financial bubble. As a result, some cities grew richer, while others simply dropped out of the game. Even though the economy kept growing, by the mid-2000s it was already clear that things under the hood weren't perfect. The 2008 financial crisis didn't create the problem. It ripped the cover off and exposed how dependent the country had become on finance, and how little it had invested elsewhere. The model worked, but only as long as everything ran smoothly. Once the system faltered, the weak points became too obvious to ignore. Today, the consequences of that choice are felt everywhere. Healthcare is overloaded, housing has become unaffordable, and infrastructure looks like it's been switched to permanent power-saving mode. These aren't sudden failures, but the neatly accumulated result of decisions made many years ago. Now the bill has arrived, and it needs to be paid quickly, if anyone still wants to talk about a sustainable future. If you ask people directly what frustrates them most, the answer is usually the same. Housing. The problem isn't just that there aren't enough homes. The real pain is that existing housing increasingly feels like it's not for you. Buying a first flat without an income well above average is close to fantasy. The standard alternative is the bank of mom and dad, if you happen to have one. And it's not because Britain suddenly forgot how to build. The country simply spent years constructing fewer homes than a growing population required. Strict planning rules, weak funding for social housing, and the eternal priority of anything except building did their job. Housing turned from a basic part of life into a giant filter. Who gets to build a future here, and who should probably renew their passport? In short, the formula is simple. Too few homes, too many people. And this isn't a sudden system bug, but a carefully accumulated result of decades. Britain built fewer homes than it needed for years, and eventually the market skewed so badly that demand ran far ahead, while supply is still looking for directions. The roots of this story go back to the late 70s, when the government launched the Right to Buy policy. The idea sounded great. Tenants of council housing were allowed to buy their homes at a discount. Almost social magic. Yesterday you rented, today you own. The catch was one small detail that was quietly ignored at the time. Homes were sold, but almost no new ones were built to replace them. As a result, the stock of social housing started melting like ice in July. Since the 70s, it has shrunk by roughly a quarter, while the population kept growing. Homes disappeared, people didn't. Even back then, it was clear this would get interesting, just not in the way anyone had hoped. As social housing declined and buying became harder, people flooded into the private rental market. And there, textbook economics kicked in. Demand rises, supply lags. Prices shoot up. This hit hardest those whose incomes were already nowhere near "I can afford anything." Competition for the limited number of even vaguely affordable options became a contest of wallets. If your wallet lost, you kept searching, or didn't find anything at all. What makes things worse is another factor. For more than 30 years, house prices have been rising faster than real wages. Homes get more expensive, while incomes pretend nothing is happening. The gap between those who own property and those who rent is slowly turning into a full-blown chasm. For some, assets grow almost automatically. For others, only rent and stress levels keep increasing. Yes, housing shortages aren't unique to Britain, but here they hit especially hard. In England today, there are about 1.4 million fewer households in social housing than there were in the early 80s. Inequality isn't growing somewhere in reports. It's visible in everyday life. Overcrowded flats, shared rooms for 3 people, temporary solutions that somehow last for years. This is where so-called hidden homelessness comes from. Not necessarily sleeping on the street with a cardboard sign, but temporary accommodation. Hotels, hostels, all those just-for-now options. It sounds softer, but in reality, it's the same dead end. After several years of decline, the number of such households in England has skyrocketed, from 48,000 in the early 2010s to 112,000 by 2023. An all-time record, and hardly something to celebrate. The conditions in this kind of housing are a horror genre of their own. Damp, mold, cockroaches, mice, the full package. People are constantly moved around, which knocks adults out of stable work and children out of school. What kind of social mobility can you talk about when your address changes more often than the school timetable? In those conditions, the chance of moving up the income ladder shrinks to a rounding error. On top of everything else, there's the blow to local government budgets. In just the past year, council spent nearly £1.8 billion on emergency accommodation. In real terms, that figure has more than doubled over the past decade. This money isn't going into development or the future. It's being burned on permanent firefighting for a crisis that should have been prevented long ago. Strip it down, and there are 3 core reasons behind this mess. Hardly any homes are being built. Social housing keeps shrinking. Support for those who can't afford market rents is slowly being eroded. And there's no sign of a magical turnaround anytime soon. Another reason people are leaving the UK is the migration reality the country never really learned how to manage. Not migration as a fact, but the way it was left to drift, without clear rules, without expectations, and without any serious attempt to integrate newcomers into the existing system.
I understand your concern.
In many English cities, the pattern looks the same. Areas that used to be ordinary working-class neighborhoods gradually turn into closed-off enclaves. Not because anyone is evil, but because the state decided that integration was a word, not a job. The result is spaces where British urban culture simply stops being dominant. Shops change, the language on the streets changes, social norms shift, even everyday rules of behavior. For long-term residents, this doesn't feel like diversity. It feels like being pushed out. It's important to be clear. This isn't about food, music, or holidays. Those are always packaged nicely. The real conflict starts where different ideas about city life collide. About public space, the role of women, how children are raised, attitudes to the law, neighbors, noise, work, and responsibility. When those clashes pile up, people stop feeling that the city is theirs. And that's one of the strongest triggers for leaving. There's also the visible and social decline of neighborhoods. Overcrowded housing, illegal rentals, rubbish, overstretched schools and hospitals. It creates a slum-like feeling, not in the classic sense, but in a very European one. The city technically exists, infrastructure is technically there, but the quality of the environment drops so fast that you start avoiding your own area. And when this happens not on the outskirts, but a few stops from the city center, people draw conclusions. At the same time, many Britons see an obvious imbalance. The state spends resources on bringing in new people, yet struggles to meet its basic obligations to those already living there. Waiting lists for doctors grow, schools are overcrowded, social housing is out of reach, and the explanation is always the same. There's no money. Against that backdrop, a feeling emerges that the system works for everyone except you. And that feeling is deeply toxic. Another factor is the cultural gap no one is even trying to close. For a long time, Britain assumed that simply allowing everyone to be different would somehow make everything work. In practice, without shared rules and expectations, the opposite happens. Each group starts living by its own norms. Over time, the common cultural space that once made British cities feel British, with their habits, irony, communication style, and unwritten rules, begins to disappear. For many, it feels like the country is slowly losing itself, while no one even attempts an honest conversation about it. Any attempt to talk seriously about migration problems instantly turns either into moral preaching or shouting. As a result, real discussion becomes impossible, and frustration builds quietly, until someone simply decides to leave. Young families feel this especially sharply. When you're thinking not just about yourself, but about your children, the environment becomes the main concern. What kind of school? What kind of classmates? What values will be considered normal? When those questions start to cause anxiety, the choice becomes pragmatic. Move somewhere where the rules are clear and the environment is stable. The irony is that Britain long prided itself on its ability to attract people from all over the world. But attracting is one thing. Managing the process is something else entirely. Without a clear migration policy, without integration requirements, and without investment in areas where pressure is growing fastest, the system simply falls apart. And the people who pay the price are those with no political influence and no real ability to change anything. In the end, for many, leaving isn't an ideological statement. It's a way to preserve their quality of life. People aren't running from diversity, they're running from chaos, from the feeling of lost control, and from the sense that their city no longer belongs to them. And until Britain starts dealing honestly with the consequences of its own migration policy, this outflow will continue. Quietly, without slogans, but steadily.